This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breege Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally. Politi, John H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Jeffrey B., Gabby, Helen M., Sunny H., Scott K., JRM, Susie G., Eldritch Priest, B. Lupita, C. Roberts, Jeanette, DS, Jake B., CDV, Allie, V!V, Mary Beth R., Ida B., Eric N., Tana, May, Christine F., Alex C., Samantha G., Alcanet, and Teddy O. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there's so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello, and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breege Burke. The subject of today's podcast is Eris, who is the goddess associated with chaos and discord. The Greek translation of the name has to do with strife. Now, it's very odd because when I was looking at my podcast list, I was thinking, I could swear I've done Eris already. Like, I feel like I did Eris in a previous time. Like, it's almost like a deja vu. Like, I swear I've done this before. Maybe it's one of those Mandela effects things. I have no idea. But I just know that I feel like I've done this one. But I cannot find that I have done Eris in any of my podcast lists, or even as an earlier one. I mean, Eris certainly would have been a good topic when I was talking about other Greek figures like Hera and Artemis, and just other Athena, other Olympian type figures, or other Greek mythological figures. Eris would have been a good one to cover, but anyway, if we haven't covered her, then we're going to cover her now and talk a bit about her. And the main things I want to cover are her, obviously a discussion of who she is and what she personifies, what writings exist about her, and also some other discussions about Eris, or more modern uses of the name in terms of the things like, for example, the Discordians, who use Eris, the Gospel of Eris, the Principia Discordia, which I'm not sure if they've determined. I've heard different things about the names. I know that Robert Anton Wilson was definitely associated with the Principia, but I don't know the other names. I'm not quite remembering. But in any case, what I want to do today is take a look at, again, the traditional Greek Eris as she's represented in Hesiod in particular, is where we learn about her. And for this, I'm going to reference a couple of different things. I'm going to reference, I do have the Wikipedia article up with some of the standard background, but I also have my own book. I will be citing myself today because I have a long section in my book about Eris and about her associations, particularly with regard to the context that we would consider in this podcast, given that I look at archetypal psychology as a connection point for talking about these figures. So we're going to talk about her in terms of ancient Greece and her role in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And we're also going to talk about Eris as, again, in the more modern sense that she tends to be used in other contexts, and where she's been used in other mentions where we talk about things in terms of her cultural influence. That's the word. That's the phrase I was searching for there. And where this appears. And then we'll also talk a little bit, not very much, but maybe just mentioning of Eris as a planet that's actually the planet Eris, or I guess it's dwarf planet, I guess is the term that they use. The dwarf planet Eris is actually larger than Pluto, interestingly enough, but not considered part of the 9 planets that, at least that I learned growing up, although now it seems most astronomers stop with Neptune and assume Pluto and Eris are just these kind of dwarf planets, like, meandering aimlessly in the outer realms of the solar system. And I guess erratically is more the word. So I might just make a brief mention of that towards the end, but I'm going to try to make this podcast as concise as possible, just because just because of time constraints. Because in addition to what I'm teaching, I'm actually teaching 2 more classes this weekend. I've got 4 hours today of teaching, and I've got 6 hours tomorrow of teaching, plus all these other appointments. So, yeah, it's a rather busy time right now. So, I will stop rambling and I will try to get on with things. Okay, so first thing, Greek. I'm just going to read from Wikipedia at the top, but then I'm going to go to my own book. It says, in Greek mythology, Eris, which is Romanized as Eris, A-E-R-I-S, literally meaning strife, is the goddess and personification of strife and discord, particularly in war, and in the Iliad, where she is listed, this is in inverted commas or in quotation marks, the sister of Eris, the god of war. Okay, so they refer to her as the sister of Eris, but she's not really. According to Hesiod, she was the daughter of primordial Nyx, which is the goddess of night, and the mother of a long list of undesirable personified abstractions, such as Ponos, which is toil, Limos, which is famine, Algia, which is pains, and Ate, which is delusion. Now, I do have actually planned a separate podcast on Ate, because Ate is very interesting. She has the central role, really, in the Iliad. It says, Eris initiated a quarrel between Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, which led to the judgment of Paris and ultimately the Trojan War. Eris's Roman equivalent is Discordia. According to Hesiod, there was another Eris, separate and distinct from Eris, daughter of Nyx, who was beneficial to men. Okay, so that frames where I want to go with this. We're going to start with Hesiod, and we're going to talk about his two Erises, so to speak. Really, I think they're just 2 aspects of the same being, because when we talk about beings like this, if you're going to talk about one being evil and one being good, I don't know. I think there's an unnecessary separation that we tend to do there. And it's interesting that this is coming from Hesiod, who's one of the oldest Greek writers. But, of course, it's quite possible, too, that Hesiod has been revised just as Homer has been. So, I don't have any proof that that's the case here, but it wouldn't surprise me. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And we are going to talk about the Judgment of Paris, which is the main story in which we see Eris. She is the sort of the central character. And as we'll see when we did the podcast on Nemesis sort of is an alternate figure that is associated with the Trojan War and its outcome, or at least a related figure as far as that goes. So so we're going to take a look at that. And again, then we're going to look at some of the cultural references to Eris, and then we're going to start looking at her in this psychological way of looking at things. So, okay, let's begin at the beginning here. Now, what I'm going to do is take a look at my book, which I have here in paper copy. Okay, and this is a section that I have in my book about Homer and Hesiod and their relationship to the other, and this is about the feminine influence. In fact, let me just see what I called this chapter heading. There's a name for it. Feminine in Greek and Babylonian religion and the afterlife. Okay, so when we look at, after I go through all the Babylonian goddesses, I have my little section here on Eris. So I'm going to start by reading from that. Eris, she is the goddess of strife or chaos, though she should not be confused with chaos. K-A-O-S is how that's transliterated. The personification of the void that brought forth the universe. Yeah, important distinction to make there, because if you look at any genealogy of Greek mythology, chaos is sort of this void that is there. It's basically this darkness, this great potential. And it's interesting to think of chaos in those terms, because chaos suggests uncertainty. There's a lack of order. There's a lack of distinction. There's a lack of structure. It's just a void. And chaos is not really defined as either a masculine or feminine being in Greek, in the Greek myth. In a sense, chaos really would be beyond gender, because chaos is something that is really undifferentiated in a lot of ways. And out of chaos there's the first 5 beings that come out, as my students just had to explain on their last midterm. And that is Tartarus, Erebus, Nyx, Eros, and Gaia. Okay, so Tartarus, which is the deepest depths of the earth that we think of as kind of the deepest abyss, in Hades, is Tartarus. Later becomes associated with punishment, or where the Titans are imprisoned, like very deep down in the earth. Of course, Gaia herself is the earth mother. Erebus is kind of the gloom of the underworld, really. It's almost more of it implies something a little bit more foggy and gloomy. And then, of course, Eros is desire. Now, again, this Eros is very likely different. In fact, you can pretty much differentiate this Eros from the son of Aphrodite, who is known as Eros or Cupid. This Eros is more like the drive, like the driving force to create. A very necessary component if you are going to manifest something out of the void of chaos. There needs to be a drive to create things. Hindu mythology, we talk about this too. Like Lalita Tripura Sundari represents, well, there's a god Kama who's a god of desire, but Lalita Tripura Sundari, when Kama is destroyed by Shiva, she resurrects Kama because desire is a key component in allowing the universe to be created. In order to create something, there has to be a drive. Okay, so that's another primordial figure. And then, of course, Nyx, who is the goddess of night, is the other one. So primordial night is where everything is born out of, including this idea of strife or chaos. So, okay, continuing on with what I say here. It's notable that Eris is a feminine noun, while chaos is neuter. Okay, so I mentioned that it's a neutral figure, is chaos. We learn about both deities from Hesiod. The Theogony mentions chaos as the abyss from which Erebus or gloom and night are born. After the invocation of Zeus, Hesiod suggests there are two Erises, and he discusses the two kinds of strife in work and days. Now, this is from the Evelyn White translation that Loeb Classic Library uses. It says, "So after all, there was not one kind of strife alone, but all over the earth there are two. As for the one, a man would praise her when he came to understand her, but the other is blameworthy, and they are wholly different in nature. For one fosters evil war and battle, being cruel. Her no man loves." It's interesting, it says no man lovers, and I don't wonder if that's a typo. "But perforce, through the will of all the deathless gods, men pay harsh strife to her honor due. But the other is the elder daughter of dark night, and the son of Kronos, who sits above and dwells in the aether, set her in the roots of the earth." Okay, so let me stop here. So Hesiod is saying that the son of Kronos. Now, son of Kronos is an epithet for Zeus. Okay, always referred to in the Iliad as Zeus, son of Kronos. And so she is this strife is the eldest daughter, or the elder daughter of the night goddess. So strife comes out of night, which of course is darkness, and Zeus, who dwells in the aether, which is the shining sky, sets her in the roots of the earth. So now this makes Eris a Chthonic deity, and she is far kinder to men. Okay, she stirs up even the shiftless to toil, for a man grows eager to work when he considers his neighbor, a rich man who hastens to plow and plant, and put his house in good order, and the neighbor vies with the neighbor as he hurries after wealth. Thus, this strife is wholesome for men. Okay, so now that's interesting. So according to Hesiod, there is a type of strife that he actually connects more to competitiveness. It's the idea that if I want what my neighbor has, then I have to, move my lazy backside and do something, right? This is almost like it's like the Eris of capitalism, right? You pull yourself up by your bootstraps and work hard, and you will be rewarded for your toil. And, you should get up and toil because your neighbor is out toiling and he's going to be rich from that. And it makes you kind of wonder if the idea that working hard will make you rich comes out of this particular idea. And certainly when you're talking about the ancient world, when it's not like now where it's like, who will get you somewhere, although I'm sure that didn't hurt at that time. It was more the idea that in order for you to be wealthy, you had to physically do the labor yourself, or you had to have, slaves, servants, or somebody out there, laborers, to outdo the labor for you. But in any case, it had to be something that you attended to. It had to be an active. This strife is an active strife, not a passive one. Okay, this is not chaos in a passive void sense. This is something that's very, very active. Okay, so. Yeah, so Hesiod portrays Eris as a necessary evil. If humans were not besieged by strife, they would be lazy and unproductive. Right, so you can think about the idea that your constant feeling, like you ever have a day off, and you sit there and you think, I should be doing something with this time. That is kind of the strife that we're talking about here. It's the one that when you get a 2-week vacation from work, and then you go to the beach, and then you bring your laptop with you, and you're still checking work email because, you got to keep up and be productive, right? Even though you're supposed to be relaxing and enjoying yourself. This is the strife that opposes any kind of leisure. Like you can't be quiet, you can't sit still and enjoy yourself because then that would be shiftless and lazy. And this is the kind of strife, I think, that dominates certainly Western societies. because there's the idea, when we actually had an opportunity to have labor-saving devices or to have the work done for us, we thought, great, now we have this labor-saving device, so now I can do more work somewhere else. So, interesting, though, to think about this as an aspect of strife or chaos. I feel that's almost telling, because there's the idea that this chaotic way of being, the sense that we frenetically have to be doing stuff all the time, is somehow good for us. Because otherwise we would be inert and not do anything. But I also think about it in connection with our mental activity as well. Because mentally, we tend to, like I said, our minds don't rest very easily. This is the reason meditation is so hard. If you were going to try to, quote unquote, think about nothing, right? Which nobody can do in meditation, and that's not really the point of it anyway. But meditation is hard. The big thing is that if you're trying to sit there and still the mind, your thoughts are running constantly at 100 miles an hour. And that's the problem with it, is that this is something that is constant. Our mind is constantly in this state of having to plan and think about its next steps and so on and so forth, rather than just resting and seeing what comes to it. So the characterization of it as a form of strife, I think, is actually quite appropriate. And now, it may be a necessary evil in some ways, and then it may also be problematic in other ways. So just moving on with my take on this in my book. If we consider the modern cliche, idle hands are the devil's workshop, we get an idea of this quote-unquote good Eris. Comparing Eris to the devil and calling her good may seem strange, but it makes perfect sense if we consider the Jungian archetype of the trickster. Tricksters are described by Jung as preconscious figures, and he believes the tricksters may be one of our most archaic archetypes. He, that is, the trickster, is obviously a psychologem, an archetypal psychic structure of extreme antiquity. In his clearest manifestations, he is a faithful reflection of an absolutely undifferentiated human consciousness, what I was talking about with chaos, corresponding to a psyche that has hardly left the animal level. Okay, now this is from Jung's essay on the psychology of the trickster archetype. That's where that came from. So, okay. Eris is an obvious symbol of an undifferentiated psyche. Well, in terms of the trickster, yes. And it also shows you Eris's connection to the original chaos. World mythologies are full of tricksters, and Eris is only one of them in Greek mythology. Even a female goddess as dignified as Hera can function as a trickster, which I talk about it later in the book. Tricksters engage in childish behavior and manifest in our everyday lives as upsets to our carefully laid plans. The biblical tricksters of the Old Testament are angels, and are described by the Hebrew word Satan. In the Bible, we see Satan in two ways as well. There is the Old Testament way, where the Satan is sent either to test or to obstruct a human being, and there is the New Testament Satan, who tests Jesus. The most obvious example is the Satan of the book of Job, who pushes Job to his limits with God's blessing. This has been one of the most difficult books for Western monotheists, but it is not so difficult if we take Hesiod's view of strife. The gods have ordained it, and it can make us better humans. Okay, that's the idea. The idea of testing you. Testing your psychological strength. Testing your ability to deal with strife, to deal with chaos, to deal with in connection with loss. Tricksters are also associated with the liminal. They push our personal boundaries and often appear as creatures that have conflicting characteristics. The quote-unquote wise fool is one such character. The discomfort experienced from this archetype relates to the human shadow. Our everyday lives are affected by psychological tricksters when our carefully laid plans go wrong. And here's a quote that I have. Since the personal shadow, in fact, is nothing more than an odds and ends collection of traits that we have failed to fuse into our conscious persona, the tricks played by this prankster are likewise disorganized. We are beset by one trifling difficulty after another. At such times, all phone calls connect to busy lines, the car needs gas, the weather is terrible, and the umbrella is at the office, and the traffic lights are all red. It is just this variety of bad luck that evidently inspired Murphy's Law, which states that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. There are numerous correlates. For example, if a slice of bread falls on the floor, it will always land butter side down, unless you follow the feline butter gravitology theory, which, gosh, that's really dating myself. That was like an early 90s, like 4chan thing. But anyway, I won't derail into that. One of the authors likes to refer to such coincidences as perverse synchronicity. And yes, this was, in fact, from a book by Combs and Holland about synchronicities. But I thought it was a good description of it. It's that chaos that comes in. We have these carefully laid plans, and there's all these little things that get in the way and that interrupt us that, screw up what it is that we're trying to do. Okay, so I'm moving on, and again, I'm still reading from my book. If you happen to own my book and want to follow along, I've been on page 50 and 51. Ignoring the trickster can be dangerous. Our other story of Eris from Greek myth concerns the wedding feast of Peleus and Thetis. And yes, this is where we're getting into the judgment of Paris. The oldest version of this story comes from the Cypria, which is part of the epic cycle. These are a series of works that are also connected to the Trojan War, but are not the Iliad and not the Odyssey. Odyssey's not really Trojan War per se, it's more post-war. But when you talk about the Cypria, you are talking about events both before and after the war. So, around the events of the Iliad. So the Cypria is a work of 11 books controversially attributed to Homer. They might be and they might not be, probably not. All of the gods are invited except Eris, and she gets her revenge by tossing a golden apple into the group with the words, "To the fairest," inscribed on it. The 3 Olympian goddesses at the feast, Aphrodite, Athena, and Hera, all want to claim the apple, and they call upon Paris, son of King Priam of Troy, to judge which one of them is the fairest. Each bribes him with different gifts. Athena will make him a great warrior. Hera will make him a great king. Aphrodite will give him Helen, queen of Sparta, who is the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris judges in Aphrodite's favor, and Helen's abduction by Paris brings about the Trojan War. Eris does not need to act directly to create conflict. She only has to plant the seeds in the ego. She tests the other female goddesses and brings out their worst trait, vanity. Okay? And this is very interesting. This is the way in which even the gods, if you are appealing to a side of them that is more vain, the way in which that can be problematic. I would not envy any human who has to stand in front of a company of gods and go, "Hey, which one of us is the prettiest?" It's like, any one of us could rip your throat out and destroy your family. So, choose wisely. Yeah. So this is the idea of how the indirect influence of strife, because she's not shown her proper respect and honor, ends up bringing about the Trojan War in this version, because that is what the Trojan War is about. You have a set of Greek warriors who were really Achaean. They call them the Achaean League in the Iliad. The Achaeans are a loose network of tribal king, states, if you will, that many of them have come to wanting the hand of Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, who is also a daughter of Zeus. But when she chooses Menelaus, king of Sparta, they all take a vow, have a pact that they will support him if any other man tries to take Helen away from him. Thus, the reason for the Trojan War. So you could argue that Eris is the cause of the Trojan War. You could argue that Aphrodite is the cause of the Trojan War. You can argue that Helen is the cause of the Trojan War. In all cases, we're talking about this feminine cause for war. And of course, you can go back and revisit my podcast called "What's Love Got to Do with It?" and the idea of love and war, love goddesses and war. So, of course, Eris is not a love goddess. She is just there to create strife. Okay, so going on with what I say here. The role of the feminine in the Trojan War is quite interesting. While Helen is considered to be the cause of the war, the opening lines of the Iliad tell us, "Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls." That is literally the opening lines of the Iliad, in English, of course. And I believe I used Robert Fagel's translation for this. So, Agamemnon has taken Chryseis, daughter of Chryses, as part of the spoils of war for himself. Her father, who is a priest of Apollo, comes begging Agamemnon for his daughter and brings a ransom. When Agamemnon refuses, Chryseis prays to Apollo to avenge him, and Apollo attacks the Achaean armies with plague. The argument of Book 1 is between Agamemnon and Achilles. Achilles tells him to give up Chryseis, and Agamemnon eventually agrees, but he takes Achilles' concubine Briseis as a consolation prize. Infuriated by this humiliation, Achilles refuses to fight. We don't see him involved in the war again until his friend Patroclus is killed in battle. We have a war over Helen, but we also have a war over Chryseis. Here's your next level down of feminine, right? Vanity, pride, and anger among both gods and humans all cause bloodshed and the destruction of Troy. And there's something interesting there. If you recall back what we said in the Nemesis podcast, there's another version in the Cypria that suggests that Thetis and Zeus actually planned this kind of, mass destruction of humans where there had been a great flood before, which there is one in Greek myth, as well as, Babylonian, Sumerian, and what we think of as the biblical version. You also have, this is almost like another attempt to destroy humankind, because the idea is that this great battle between the Achaean League and the forces of Troy, which of course did not just include people in the city of Troy itself, it also included some of their neighbors coming in to help them out, that this was going to be another event that potentially would wipe out humankind. And the fact that it is caused by strife, who manages to pick at our ideas of vanity and greed and so forth, there's sort of an underlying message there that these are the things that are actually going to destroy humankind, and they're more associated with the ego. It makes me think of the idea of the demonic in Hinduism, the idea of the Ashura, which is exactly a being of this type. They can be vain, they can be greedy, power hungry, they can be quick to anger, they have avarice. And the thing is, because they have this inclination towards self-aggrandizement, they seek spiritual power in order to fulfill their ends. That's why they always say that one should not acquire siddhis or powers through certain meditations and what we think of as tantric practices for those purposes. They're not meant to be used for that purposes, but they can be used for those purposes. So it's interesting. But we're seeing this idea that, in a way, it's the war that's causing the death, but more fundamentally, it's the way in which human beings behave, the way in which pride takes a role, and the way in which our desire to acquire stuff takes a role. And Eris, like I was talking more recently again about the ideas of the demonic in Western culture. If you ask occultists who work in that realm, and particularly the good book I was talking about with regard to this is called Low Magic with a K, and that's written by Lon Milo Duquette. I highly recommend that book for anybody who's interested in understanding, Goetia, and just sort of from a fundamental level, not in the sense of being a manual of practice, but explaining kind of the psychology of what happens in such an interaction when somebody wants to ask a demon for something, or if there's that kind of work that goes on that some occultists choose to engage in. That it's really what you're really confronting there is that weakness within yourself, and you have to be careful, because if you are not strong in yourself and do not have strong character, which is probably why a lot of these grimoires are like, well, you must be this, and this, and you must be purified and have this and have that, probably because you need to be very strong in yourself to confront your own, basically elements of your own shadow, what's weak in yourself, because that will be exploited. They'll try to kind of wheel and deal with you based on what they already know is your vulnerability, right? So it's like saying, you've got to have a very strong sense of awareness and self, and not ego aggrandizement, but just a strong, solid trust and confidence in yourself to be able to do that kind of work. So anyway, I'm just mentioning that as a side, because certainly demonic forces are equated, certainly in Western culture, with chaotic forces in a lot of ways. So, okay. And we are talking about the goddess of strife. Okay, so moving on in my book. Such emotions and the irrational are often associated with the feminine, eros rather than logos. The moon, more often than not, is a feminine symbol in mythology due to its connection with fertility. It is a symbol of the irrational. The light of the moon is reflected from the sun, and things appear shadowy in the moonlight as opposed to the clear view we get from sunlight. Here in the Iliad, we see Achaean warriors, the very embodiments of masculinity, behaving in an irrational and childish manner. This brings us back to shadow. Whatever is underdeveloped in the psyche will cause problems for us. Achilles and Agamemnon do not have a balanced sense of the feminine. They are warriors and operate consciously in a world of rules, fighting skills, and physical strength. They are not developed emotionally, and therefore their emotions become their downfall. Emotions and even quote-unquote irrationality are not quote-unquote bad. Sometimes our irrational impulses, especially our intuition, clue us into something that is not apparent logically. But if dealing with emotions is not our strength, it can cause trouble until we get it right. Esther Harding notes that both men and women in the modern world have difficulty with these aspects of the feminine. And she says, and I quote from her book, "For if a woman is out of touch with the feminine principle, which dictates the law of relatedness, she cannot take the lead in what is after all the feminine realm, that of human relationships. Many women suffer seriously in their personal lives on account of the neglect of the feminine principle." And that's an interesting and incredibly true statement. We talk about the dichotomy between men and women, and you talk about this patriarchal idea of woman as supposed to having to submit to the man, right? But, but we have this thing that goes on in culture now where women are saying, heck with that. I'm not here to submit to you. That's not the understanding of relatedness or even passivity, because you're taking that active masculine, passive feminine very, very literally in terms of gender and biology, and saying, oh, well, because the feminine is passive, therefore it's women's role to submit and be passive, or that relatedness thing. So women are always going to be concerned about the family and the raising of the kids, right? You have these ideas that we try to translate into social norms and structures. And women are trying to break out of that. Rightly so, because the feminine is not, with a capital F, does not mean what women do. Just as masculine with a capital M should not be what men do. There needs to be a balanced, non-toxic version of both. But in a society where being male is considered to be the privilege or the apex or the height of something, as opposed to being female, that being male is dominant, women will take on characteristics of that dominance in their interactions with each other and with other people. Now, again, to a certain degree, it's not a matter of whether it's good or evil. I mean, certainly taking on that masculine sense can be where we set boundaries and separations rather than just simply trying to relate. And setting boundaries is not always a bad thing. Women who are saying, I'm not going to accept abusive relationships, either physically or emotionally, there needs to be that sense of sovereignty, that sense of I am in my own power and this is who I am. But what tends to get lost, and this is not just in women, I mean, Esther Harding is noting that this tendency towards the masculine, she mentions women specifically because you would think it's not a matter of men being masculine and women being feminine. It's a matter of men being masculine and women also being masculine. Because to be feminine is somehow to be flawed in some way, or weak, or unproductive, or just passive, lazy, watery, deferential, not having the strength and decisiveness of the masculine, but it's not that cut and dried. We create these dichotomies, but they're not real. And so I feel like what women are doing now is breaking down the false idea of what it means to be a woman with respect to the feminine. But I think there also does need to be an awareness that both men and women need to adopt more of the feminine. It doesn't mean that to the total exclusion of the masculine, but that both would do well to try to come together and to form community by both people, both genders, both sexes, acknowledging the role of the feminine. Because that has nothing to do with what men do and what women do. And it's back to this whole idea of the archetype. To be feminine means to try to be nurturing, to try to be understanding, to try to reach out instead of to cut off, instead of making war, trying to negotiate, right? It's all of these things that are about trying to be open, to open the heart, to be vulnerable. It's more emotionally based. And as I've said many times, vulnerability actually shows more strength than somebody who is invulnerable. We think of invulnerability that we're going to conquer something, and that's the way we treat it. Like, I'm going to use my mind to beat this or that into submission. That's not true strength. That's actually a very easy thing to do. It's harder when you have been hurt, wounded, and rejection to keep your heart open. That is by far the harder thing to do. But we are not used to working within that realm of the feminine with a capital F. So we're not used to relatedness. And that doesn't mean just running around trying to get people's approval, because that's what we think of it too. Relationship means having to gain the approval of other people. It doesn't have to mean that. You retain your sovereignty, but you keep an open heart to people. So if you're strong in yourself, you can be open and vulnerable to other people without being pulled into deceptions or being pulled into people's agendas or having to seek the approval of people. If you just naturally flow with something, that everything naturally flows the other way. So anyway, I'm getting a little bit derailed here, but nonetheless, the point being is that, this idea of the feminine is something that is, this idea of relatedness is something that we are dismissive of in culture. To be strong means you have to be unemotional. To be strong means you have to close your heart off and to, pull your sword out and throw the challenge down or to walk away and give the middle finger. There's definitely this idea of this missing element of connectedness that I think we desperately need. Okay, so anyway, I don't want to belabor that too long. Hesiod has much more to say about Eris in the Theogony, as she is listed as the mother of toil, forgetfulness, famine, tearful sorrows, fightings, battles, murders, manslaughters, quarrels, lying words, disputes, lawlessness, and ruin. Wow. All of these things that break down structure. Here he describes her as abhorred. The Theogony was written earlier than Works and Days, and it's interesting that Hesiod's attitude towards strife becomes more accepting in the later work. Scholars believe that Works and Days was written in the midst of an agricultural crisis. Hesiod addresses his brother Perses, who has manipulated the law to take away most of his land. He not only censures his brother and the judges who awarded him the land, but resigns himself to the difficulties of life. Joseph Campbell says we should participate in the pain of life, and Jung would agree. You open the gates of the soul, so this is a quote from Jung in his Red Book, actually. You open the gates of the soul to let the dark flood of chaos flow into your order and meaning. If you marry the order to chaos, you produce the divine child, the supreme meaning beyond meaning and meaninglessness. I have had to recognize that I must submit to what I fear. Yes, even more, that I must even love what horrifies me. There's your element of the sublime there. We must learn such from that saint who was disgusted by the plague infections. She drank the pus of plague boils and became aware that it smelled like roses. The acts of the saint were not in vain. So interesting, right? This gets us back to Latzoteo and the idea of filth, right? Okay, so that's what I have written on Eris in my book, and I think it's interesting to ponder on, because the idea is that strife and chaos are something that allow us to come into confrontation with the shadow, that allow us to move into a state of non-ego, to identify ourselves a bit more as something that is not just about the image we project, the approval that we want, and the things of this world that we want to acquire or achieve. It's not a invalidation of wanting that kind of fortune. It's not saying, oh, you shouldn't strive for these things. But it's almost like in order to, when we get to those things, when we get caught up in those kinds of things, we can actually forget the bigger picture. We can lose contact with nature. We can lose contact with the collective in our attempt to distinguish ourselves. And Eris is this force that reminds us perhaps of the original chaos, that is something undifferentiated. Now, this is also something that terrifies us, because in Freud's terms, this would be an idea of regression, right? The idea that one goes back to the womb. Erich Neumann, who is one of Jung's students, used to refer to the feminine as the great round. So this is the idea that, like, this womb that you are born out of, and there's this fear that you are going to be undifferentiated. Because initially, you are not differentiated from the mother. You are in the womb, and you are not considered different. So after you are born, it's like now you are differentiated. The whole thing about object relations psychology is that it's the process of how you become differentiated, how you transition from different phases and become more of an individual, recognized in your own right for your own, talents, gifts, unique achievements, your own foibles, and whatever else you may have. But it's also that reminder, it's like from dust you came, and to dust you shall return, right? Especially as we get older. There was just a piece that I had posted to my story, I think on Transition Life Coaching, about there's the Instagram account called Philemon is Alive. Philemon's being spelled Philemon, is alive, one word. He has a really great account, and he goes in depth in a lot of these Jungian concepts. And this one was about the idea of the non-ego, and the idea that as we pass a certain point in life, especially as we get to midlife, that we are no longer about trying to build our social identity, but rather about this non-ego, where there may be this turn more towards spiritual matters. Again, this is something that's actually part of normal Hindu cycle of life transitions, where there's the idea of, let's just say a man, for argument's sake, who is a child who is born and then grows up, and at a certain age, they have one ceremony, I think, at the age of 12. Then you have another ceremony when you're married, and then when you have children, and then all that kind of stuff. And then at some point, there's the idea that once the children are grown and one retires, that now one might withdraw into the forest, into a spiritual life, to live as a sannyasi and seek liberation instead of the things of the world. Now, this does not necessarily happen, and it's not even necessarily that should happen, but it does convey the idea that we reach a point in life where the ego breaks down. And because we're dealing with this liminal space, with this transition space, okay, this is where you have this Erisian kind of influence. Things can become very, very chaotic. They can break down because our old way of understanding things is no longer the way that it is. Yeah, so I mentioned the Principia Discordia, which I have a copy of in front of me as well. I was lucky to get a copy of this. I guess you probably still can get copies, but I got this from Lumpanix Publishing, I think back in 1995. And yeah, it's got an introduction by Robert Anton Wilson. And yeah, so there's a bunch of things that are in here. What I want to find is this thing that they say about Erisianism. And okay, so here's their version of the myth of the apple of discord from Eris. Now, I should mention for people who don't know what Discordianism is or Erisianism, this is, they basically said, is this a religion that's disguised as a joke or a joke that's disguised as a religion? Because it's literally meant to be a religion of chaos, but it takes another view of Eris, and that is actually almost a silly one. So I'm going to read the myth of the apple of discord from Principia Discordia. It says, it seems that Zeus was preparing a wedding banquet for Peleus and Thetis, and did not want to invite Eris because of her reputation as a troublemaker. And then he said, this is called the doctrine of the original snub. This made Eris angry, so she fashioned an apple of pure gold, and ascribed upon it Callisti, to the prettiest one. And they have a footnote saying, there is historic disagreement concerning whether this apple was metallic gold or Acapulco. And on the day of the fete, she rolled it into the banquet hall and then left to be alone and joyously partake of a hot dog. Now, the three of the invited goddesses, Athena, Hera, and Aphrodite, each immediately claimed belong to herself because of the inscription. And they started fighting and they started throwing punch all over the place and everything. It says, and then the footnote was, actually there were 5 goddesses, but the Greeks did not know the law of 5s. Finally, Zeus calmed things down and declared that an arbitrator must be selected, which was a reasonable suggestion, and all agreed. He sent them to a shepherd of Troy, whose name was Paris, because his mother had a lot of gall and married a Frenchman. Ha, right? But each of the sneaky goddesses had tried to outwit the others by going early and offering a bribe to Paris. Athena offered him heroic war victories, Hera offered him great wealth, and Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman on earth. Being a healthy young Trojan lad, Paris promptly accepted Aphrodite's bribe. She got the apple, and he got screwed. As she had promised, she maneuvered earthly happenings so that Paris could have Helen, the Helen, then living with her husband, Menelaus, king of Sparta. Anyway, everyone knows that the Trojan War followed when Sparta demanded their queen back, and that the Trojan War is said to be the first war among men. And so we suffer because of the original snub. And so a Discordian is to partake of no hot dog buns. Do you believe that? So it's very, very funny. But there's another wonderful thing in here that I love. Here it is. This has to do with the curse of Greyface and the introduction of negativism. So I'm going to read this. Because again, we're trying to illustrate, you've got Hesiod's 2 Erises, right? You've got the Eris who makes you productive and keeps you from being lazy. You've got the Eris that does create war and disorder and things like that. And then you've got this Eris. It says, to choose order over disorder, or disorder over order, is to accept a trip composed of both the creative and the destructive. But to choose the creative over the destructive is an all-creative trip composed of both order and disorder. To accomplish this, one need only accept creative disorder along with and equal to creative order, and also be willing to reject destructive order as an undesirable equal to destructive disorder. And they have a little chart here. Destroy, create, and order and disorder kind of on one, destroy and create on one axis and order and disorder on the other one. The Curse of Greyface included the division of life into order and disorder as the essential positive-negative polarity, instead of building a game foundation with creative destructive as the essential positive-negative. He has thereby caused man to endure the destructive aspects of order and prevented man from effectively participating in the creative uses of disorder. Civilization reflects this unfortunate division. People, basically the Erisians, proclaims that the other division is preferable and that we work towards the proposition that creative disorder, like creative order, is possible and desirable, that destructive order, like destructive disorder, is unnecessary and undesirable. Seek the sacred cow, CHAO, play on chaos, but sacred cow. Therein you find the foolishness of all order disorder. They are the same. Okay, so this is the introduction of negativism into the world. So in other words, what they're saying here is that disorder can be used creatively, and that destructive disorder is unnecessary. Okay, so war is unnecessary, essentially, things like that. But we could use disorder in a much different way. Okay, so this is an Erisian magic ritual, the Turkey Curse. Revealed by the apostle Dr. Van Mojo as a specific counter to the evil curse of Greyface, the Turkey Curse is here passed on to Erisians everywhere for their just protection. Now, by the way, just to mention what Greyface is this sort of idea or this being that suggests that everything in life is serious and must be taken seriously with deadly seriousness. All of your actions, everything you do are really serious. The way you present yourself is deadly serious. And if there's anything that goes wrong, that's also really serious, right? So it's the idea that anything that interrupts what is considered to be the social order or whatever is planned is somehow like bad in a way that's cataclysmic. It's like the end of everything. It's a source of shame. It's the reason we shouldn't express ourselves. And so, as a specific counter to the evil curse of Greyface, the Turkey Curse is here passed on to Erisians everywhere for their just protection. And here we go. It says, the Turkey Curse works. It is firmly grounded on the fact that Greyface and his followers absolutely require an anaristic setting to function, and a timely introduction of an eristic vibration will neutralize their foundation. The Turkey Curse is designed solely to counteract negative anaristic vibes, now anaristic being anti-Eris, anti-chaos, and if introduced into a neutral or positive anaristic setting, like a poet working out word rhythms, it will prove harmless, or at worst, simply annoying. It is not designed for use against negative eristic vibes, although it can be used in an eristic vehicle to introduce positive vibes into a misguided eristic setting. In this instance, it would be the responsibility of the Erisian magician to manufacture the positive vibrations if results are to be achieved. Caution! All magic is powerful and requires courage and integrity on the part of the magician. This ritual, if misused, can backfire. Positive motivation is essential for its self-protection. So here it is. To perform the Turkey Curse, take a foot stance as if you were John L. Sullivan preparing for fisticuffs. Face the particular Greyface you wish to short-circuit, or towards the direction of the negative anaristic vibration that you wish to neutralize. Begin waving your arms in an elaborate manner and making motions with your hands as though you were a mandrake feeling up a sexy giantess. Chant loudly and clearly, gobble, 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 gobble. The results will be instantly apparent. So, yeah. So there's your other Erisianism. Basically, just stand there and be silly, and diffuse any kind of serious situation by just doing that. And again, results can backfire. But it is the idea of discord as maybe not taking things so seriously, or being able to relax into the flow and accept the fact that not everything flows in an orderly fashion. In fact, order to some degree may be overrated. And I'm going to end with the assertion that I have always made, that human psychology and human consciousness is not rational. It is irrational. We pride ourselves on being of rationality, and this is where we get into this quote-unquote Greyface modality, because we take everything very, very seriously, and we take ourselves very, very seriously. Like we are just like the super smart, bestest, whatever kind of people, and we don't see the humor in things. We don't laugh at and enjoy when there are mistakes or slip-ups, or bloopers in our lives. We feel that if we have made a mistake, this is an occasion for shame and hiding our face, and that if other people do things that are silly, we're just supposed to frown and go, "This is not serious." I think of Dave Barry. What was it? He had in the beginning of one of his books, he was talking about humor impairment. And he was a humor columnist. And he had said, if I show a picture of Richard Nixon wearing a weasel as a necktie, he says either one piece is, who's humor impaired? He says, the guy who goes, ha ha ha, or the one who says, this man is making a joke about a former president of the United States and, disrespecting his office and etc. And he said, so which one's humor impaired? He says, the answer is neither, because both people were aware that a joke was being made. The humor impaired would be like, a weasel? Why would he be wearing that? Yeah. So there's people who are deeply unaware of humor, and then there are those who, are aware of it, but perhaps, take it like we should be very, very serious all the time. And it kind of goes back to what Jung had said about having an outlet for the trickster, having an outlet for, quote unquote, the devil. that ancient religion provided. And the problem is, if you don't have that outlet, then that devil has nowhere to go but deeper and deeper into your unconscious, where it actually now does become a threat because it's something you're going to see projected out in the world and not in yourself. So anyway, I'm going to stop there because that is another rabbit hole I could go down. Thank you so much for listening. If you do enjoy this podcast and you're not a member of my Patreon, please consider subscribing at patreon.com/Chthonia. I am on social media right now at Chthonia Podcast, one word, on Instagram, and really also on YouTube as well. If you do youtube.com/@Chthonia Podcast, you'll find me. But on Instagram, I am on Facebook, same thing, although you could search it as two words, Chthonia Podcast. And you can check out work on my website at chthonia.net. I've just redone it, and I've noticed there's a little tweaking on the phone end that needs to be done. But for right now, I've got material there, and I'm hoping to expand on it when my life is a little bit less chaotic. So thank you again so much for listening and for joining me, and thank you so much again to all of my patrons, and I will catch up with you in the next episode.